Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. An old friend is back on this week's episode, Tyler Tachman, who wrote for Inside the Hall for 2 seasons before moving on. Last year, he wrote for the Indy Star. Now he is covering Iowa for the Des Moines Register, but he still keeps up with the program. And given his history the past couple of years covering the team, covering the Archie Miller era, covering beginning of the Mike Woodson era, figured it'd be a good time to have him on and get his thoughts from afar on the state of Indiana basketball as we sit here 16 games into the season. Tyler's joining us from a snowed-in apartment in Iowa City. Tyler, how's it going?
I'm surviving the snowmageddon. Probably top 2 most snows I've seen in my life. So it almost it basically snowed for 24 hours straight. So it was interesting to say the least. But anyways, Indiana basketball, probably nothing really controversial going on right now, right? So this should be pretty straightforward.
Not exactly. Obviously, you've been watching from afar. You're covering Iowa. Did a great job this season covering Iowa football. Now digging into Big Ten basketball. I know you watch because you text me a lot. You watch as much Big Ten basketball as anybody, including Indiana, seeing most of their games. Just what do you make of where this team is right now based on kind of where it's been the past couple seasons? Obviously, a lot of roster changes, but you mentioned just kind of the state of the program right now, people not necessarily being thrilled with how things are going. But I'm curious just to get your take on where things stand right now, 16 games into the season for the Hoosiers.
I'll start. I have some bigger picture ideas. I'll start specifically with this team, but the thing that's really stood out to me in a negative fashion is that just the lack of fight, right? Because I think that's one thing that over the first 2 seasons of the Mike Woodson era that we've been accustomed to seeing, and I even go back to that Syracuse game, Mike Woodson's first season at IU, where Indiana just played terribly in the first half. But they gave good punches back. It ended up going to multiple overtimes. They lost, but that was an indication of okay, this was an Archie Miller team that probably would have just rolled over and just taken the punches. I think that is the fight we've gotten accustomed to seeing over the first 2 seasons. We even look at when Indiana had their backs up against the wall, end of the season, they were trending toward not making the NCAA tournament. Down big to Michigan early on in that Big Ten tournament game. They fight back. They beat Illinois. They end up making the first 4. That felt like kind of validation of what Mike Woodson was building. And that was basically just all contingent upon the fight that team, had. And I think you can even look at last season where got down big to Arizona and, ended up making it at least a competitive contest. But there was fight, and it just feels like that lacks in this team. And maybe that was because Trace Jackson Davis was kind of the heartbeat that made that go. But there's been times this season where it seems more often than the last 2 seasons, this team has just not gotten up after it's gotten hit. You look at the Auburn game, you look at the Nebraska game. I think Rutgers is another good example. It feels like there's a lack of intensity, a lack of fight, whatever you want to say it. And I don't mean this personally in any way, but, this team I would say is soft. And I think people would probably agree with that. Again, it's not like a personal shot or anything. They just don't have that kind of toughness to them that you need to be able to survive in the Big Ten and in college basketball.
So is that something you feel like is just kind of embedded in a team as the season goes along in terms of this is what they are 16 games in? Do you think that's something that can change as the season moves along? Because I do think people were a little bit encouraged. Despite all the close games early in the season, they were figuring out a way to win those games. So there was maybe a little bit of a positive in that you learn to win, like when you're faced with some adversity. Obviously, the Morehead State game is a perfect example. They really had no business winning that game, but they found a way. And I think a lot of people, kind of as the computer numbers tanked as the season began and kept going down and down. You look at their KenPom ranking, and people are like, all right, when's this going to turn around? It hasn't. But I think they were kind of clinging on to this whole promise of the talent that was assembled here, the fact that Xavier Johnson had been out, he's back now, that Trey Galloway has some experience, and the fact that they were still figuring out a way to win, and maybe when they got into Big Ten play, they could figure it out. I agree with you. And there's kind of, when you say soft, I think there's kind of two parts to it for me. There's mentally soft, and there's also the physical soft part. I think the physical part comes out in the fact that they're, I think, the second or third tallest team in terms of average height on KenPom. And they're one of the, they're in the 200s, 225 or lower in both offensive and defensive rebounding percentage. That shouldn't be the case. I know teams are taking a lot of threes against Indiana. There's a lot of log rebounds. Those are trickier to grab than when a team's, shooting closer to the basket. But it shouldn't be giving up so many offensive rebounds. To me, that's kind of falls in line with the toughness, soft kind of label. But there's also the mental side of it. When you're going into a place like Rutgers, and I'm not saying Indiana should have won the game the other night, or it was definitely a winnable game, but kind of looking at even last season's team, they went there and only scored 48 points, and it's a tough place to play. Rutgers admittedly is not as good as they have been in the past, but you have to have that grit in terms of mindset when you go into Rutgers. You know what it's going to be, right? They're going to play tough defense. There's going to be runs in the game, and you have to be able mentally to be ready for that. I'm just curious if you think this is something that's fixable as the season goes along, or is it, we're 16 games in. I feel like we have a pretty decent body of evidence. I'm almost to the side of where it's going to take a huge turnaround for this to change.
It's interesting you bring up the kind of early season games were probably closer than they should have been, because I think you can look at it two ways. One is that they were winning games that they shouldn't have, and hey, that's a positive. They're not playing their best. They're still finding ways to win. The other side to that is those games should never have even been that close. Like Indiana should not have gone down to the wire against Morehead State and, those type of teams. Is that right? It was Morehead State, right? That was, yeah. Yeah. So, and I think that side of things has proved to be more true as the season has gone on, that, okay, this wasn't a team that was kind of finding ways to win in spite of their flaws, that this was a team being weighed down by their flaws and, having difficulties overcoming them. Now, and I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because the season isn't over. Indiana still has more opportunities left. If you want to look at it from a positive spin, this is a team that is built to get better as the season goes on because of all the roster turnover, because of, X, and I know he's taken heat. I don't want to really speak, this is excluding what Mike Woodson called the fiasco in the Rutgers game, but he's a guy that, he just hasn't played much competitive basketball over the last two seasons. So I'd give him more time before piling on and deciding, is he the guy that Indiana needs or not? But this is a team that is built to possibly get better as the season goes on because of, the young guys, Khalil Ware, Malik Renew. And I know people probably don't want to hear about them being young, but they're still a very new team when it comes to cohesiveness, very much like Mike Woodson's first team at Indiana. And that team figured it out at the end of the season. Now, you don't have a leader like Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson, Miller Kopp on this team. I'm not confident that Indiana is going to figure it out, but the talent isn't an issue. And I think that's probably another debate that's come up. They have 4-star, 5-star guys. They have a guy that's probably going to be a lottery pick in Khalil Ware, or at least a first-round pick, Mackenzie Mbako. I don't think the talent is the issue. I think it's a matter of being able to kind of bring it all together and make it work.
You mentioned the talent. I agree with you in terms of the star ranking and kind of how these guys maybe project at the next level. Khalil Ware is obviously a guy who's gotten a lot of hype as a potential first-round pick. And Mbako came in as a top 10 player. Malik Renew, I think, was a top 30 recruit out of high school. So these guys can play and obviously we're well recruited and have potential to play at the next level. But I think one thing that people have started to really question with this particular team, and just in terms of Mike Woodson and how he's building this program, is the roster construction and how the pieces fit together. And last week when Ryan was on the show, he kind of mentioned just more of the fact that sometimes it's not just about the talent, it's about how the pieces all fit together. And that's really more important than having, 5-star guys, because we've seen in the past with teams like, Kentucky, some of John Calipari's teams where he's had assembled, a lot of highly ranked players, but it hasn't necessarily translated to wins. And I think kind of the most head scratching thing to me just with this particular team is, I know Indiana tried to do some things in the offseason with the transfer portal and try to get some guards, but when you look at this roster, the guards simply are not good enough in terms of what they need to be able to do to create for others. And I know X has been out, but in 2 of the 3 games he's been back now, he's had a high number of turnovers in road games and just hasn't played particularly well. And Trey Galloway is so limited as a shooter that it's really not hard to prepare to play against Indiana if you're an opposing team, because they're not going to burn you from the outside. The ball is going to go inside. And now that they're not a great rebounding team, you can just kind of relentlessly crash the offensive glass and probably get some second chance opportunities. So how much of this is just Indiana not I know you mentioned kind of these new pieces fitting together, but also just wonder, are these the right pieces to have and to try to make a team that's cohesive and able to win?
I think you make a good point because, like I said, I don't believe talent is an issue, but I also don't think that it's distributed in the right way, because Indiana in the offseason basically bet on its returning guards and wings to be able to be good enough. And they also brought in Mackenzie Mbako. But that bet on those guys being good enough has not paid off because Indiana's wings, guards have not been good enough. And when you look at what they try to do in the portal, getting a guy like Dalton Connect, that's like the type of player that they badly need. Some kind of, scoring guard wing, that can make plays for himself. But, and I don't want to pile too much on, the current roster or whatever, but the guys, the guards and the wings that came back, just, they have not been good enough. Indiana put faith that those guys were going to develop and get better. And I think you're really seeing like how much Indiana misses like a guy like Miller Kopp, man. And he was not prolific by any means, but someone that is just reliable, knows his role, can shoot. And the startling thing a little bit is that you could see the progression of what Indiana was going towards, right? Mike Woodson started with a roster that, it had Miller Kopp, Parker Stewart, as, it's kind of wings or guards. Then it went to Tamar Bates. You feel like maybe they're starting to build momentum to getting that kind of the wings that they needed. And I feel like this season has been a major plateau or step back of that. They don't have the guys necessary. And one of the big things too, and I don't want to go on for too long here, but after last season, it became clear that Indiana needed to get more acclimated to the modern game, get bigs that can step out, can stretch the defense, and they've gotten them now. And it doesn't really matter because the guards aren't good enough. And so, I think major or roster construction is a major issue with this team because it just, the talent is there, but I'm not sure if it's all kind of in the right part.
So one thing that's kind of been interesting to watch is just how maybe the sentiment from the fan base and just how Mike Woodson's being looked at right now in terms of the job he's doing. Obviously, he came in with this mentality of winning now. He's going to try to target some of the top recruits in the country. He's going to schedule Indiana with games that are kind of aligned in terms of trying to win Big Ten championships, national championships. But then you look at some of the results, and those games have been underwhelming. They've scheduled a lot of tough games, haven't won very many of them. And now for the first time this season, I feel like he's being questioned in terms of a lot of the decisions that he's making as a coach. Something that really didn't happen the first two seasons. And it doesn't seem like he's really necessarily reacting to it in the best way when you look at some of the way he's handled the questions in the press conference. Obviously, he's entitled to his own opinion in terms of how he wants to run his team, but also the Indiana job, as you know, you covered it going back into the Archie Miller era. I've covered it really under Kelvin Sampson, Tom Crean. When things aren't going well, the scrutiny is at a very high level, and you have to be prepared to answer tough questions, and a lot of people just nitpicking every decision that you make. What have you thought just from afar watching this team in terms of some of the things that, like the common criticisms of this team? Obviously, the maybe lack of adjusting to the modern game, not taking maybe as many threes, and almost seeming indifferent to it. When you hear him talk about it, it's like he understands that it's part of the game, but he also doesn't want to embrace it. And then the substitution thing is kind of the other thing that a lot of people have brought up. I've brought it up countless times on Twitter this season, maybe not in a critical way, but just kind of pointing out that these mass substitutions, and he talks about this second unit that he wants to develop. It's almost like an NBA term, because in the NBA, you do develop a second unit. And many times that's because you have guys on the bench who, when you can bring them in, there's not going to be a huge drop off. In college, you look at some of the best teams. Kansas is a perfect example of this. They don't have a great bench, and so they ride their guys as much as possible, and they maybe go with one or two subs at a time. The other night at Rutgers, Indiana played, I believe, 10 players in the first half and 11 total in the game. And I just wonder if that's a winning strategy when you're trying to win a tough road game in a place like Piscataway, where success has been really tough to come by. So I'm just kind of curious what you've thought of how Mike Woodson's maybe handling this scrutiny, and what you kind of think of maybe his indifference to the 3-point shot and just the substitution stuff so far.
Well, one, I just want to say, and this might not be the most well received at this point of the season, but I think Mike Woodson has been good for Indiana basketball, in that after Archie Miller, it just felt like the program was just kind of a little bit lifeless, and the fan base certainly was still passionate and all that, but they just felt like there was little to no momentum at all. Mike Woodson has brought that back in terms of, over the last two seasons, there has been excitement. There has been big wins. You look at some of the wins over Purdue, the way that Mike Woodson has recruited, trying to put Indiana back towards, at least in the conversation. At the same time, I think probably what's frustrating fans is that you're seeing the same patterns when it comes to what Mike Woodson is doing from a coaching standpoint. Like the substitution thing, this isn't new. Indiana has done this from basically Mike Woodson's first year, where, there was criticism of like when they would have Michael Durr in, with bench lineups. And I think what's happening now is that it's just becoming more magnified with the struggles. It's year 3. And when the same issues keep happening, it just feels like kind of a stubbornness and lack of adjusting. And part of the reason is like, it's so obvious to the naked eye, to fans, like this is not working, and yet there is no change. So I think part of it is just that it's happened over several seasons. There doesn't really seem to be a willingness to adjust to it. And if I'm an opposing team or coach, I mean, the game plan to beat Indiana has been the same for the last 3 seasons, for the last 4 seasons, for the last 5 seasons, is I'm throwing 2 guys as soon as someone gets a post touch, I'm throwing 2 guys at the post, and I'm making the guys on the perimeter beat you. And that has seemed like a pretty reliable formula to make it happen. I think last season was probably, when you have Jalen Hood-Schifino, last season was probably the closest exception to that. But even then, Mike Woodson, you could look at it in the fact that he took Indiana to the NCAA tournament when it had not been there for so long. That's the definition of progress. He went, to the round of 64 his first season, round of 32 the next. That's progress. At the same time, he did it with one of the best programs in program history, didn't even make a Sweet 16. So that's kind of the other side to it is I don't think his teams reached the potential that they really truly could have been. So yeah, there's a lot going on, a lot of intersections of where the program is, where Mike Woodson is as a coach. It's interesting to follow from afar for sure.
Do you think it's fair, kind of the scrutiny that fans and the media are kind of giving right now in terms of just where this season is and kind of wondering where it's going to end up? Because I think the thing with Woodson is he came in with these high expectations, and I don't necessarily think that people, he made the tournament the first 2 years. I think this year people realized that the team wasn't going to be as good as it was last year, just kind of based on what was lost. But I think kind of when you set the expectation the first 2 years, you come in and make the tournament. I think people are now kind of in their minds like, all right, Indiana should be a tournament team moving forward. Maybe that's not fair, but is that the standard you feel like the program should be held to at this point? Is that fair? And are people questioning kind of some of these decisions? Is that fair at this point, or does he deserve kind of the time this year to figure it out and we see where it ends at the end of the year?
Well, both can be true. But it's legitimate to have a standard for Indiana to at least make the tournament. And given that it's Mike Woodson's third season, I think that was kind of maybe the baseline of this team. Like, that's the floor. Like, you needed them to at least get in the tournament, and right now it's not even trending that way. Here's a little bigger picture observation, and I feel like is maybe a more fundamental issue with where Indiana is right now. Is if I were to say what is Indiana basketball? They're gonna go play Indiana basketball. What is that? What is Indiana basketball right now? Because I think it was pretty evident during the Bob Knight era, and I was not around to watch that live by any means, but I've kind of gained some knowledge of what it was like just being around the program. His teams were just going to outfight people, outgrit people, be the tougher team. What is Indiana basketball right now? I don't know. And I think there might actually be more of a negative connotation with it of their team that's not going to be able to shoot, maybe not as disciplined. That's a fundamental identity that Indiana needs to find out, because as someone who I grew up watching North Carolina, if someone says they're going to play North Carolina basketball, I know what that means. That means that they're going to play unselfishly. They're going to get out on the fast break. They're going to get in the secondary break. They're going to share the ball. They're going to play tough. Maybe you have a better idea, but I don't know what Indiana basketball is right now in the modern era. I don't know what that means, playing Indiana basketball.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be set from the coach and then kind of instilled in the players and demonstrated. And I think that's why your observation's spot on. The other the disconnect with Woodson is that, and you listened to his introductory press conference, he talked about running this modern style of offense coming from the NBA. We're going to play 4 out, 1 in. We're going to shoot threes. They've not done that at all. And then he talked about a defense first mindset. And you look the first season, they were the Big Ten's best defensive team. And then you look at their Ken Pom ranking in terms of where they are as a team defensively, it's steadily gone down. So the things he kind of laid out in his introductory press conference, neither of them have come to fruition. And then you see things like poor defensive rebounding and turnovers, which have now been kind of the theme in, these last 2 road losses, Nebraska and Rutgers, programs that realistically, if Indiana is performing to its capabilities and with the resources that it has allocated to the program, should be beating more regularly than it is. They're losing now, I believe, the all-time series to Rutgers 8-9, which is, you look at Rutgers before they came into the Big Ten with Eddie Jordan, I think was the coach. That they were kind of the laughing stock of major college basketball. They got a guy in Steve Peichel who, to his credit, you ask the question, what is North Carolina basketball? You can answer the question, what is Rutgers basketball, right? Because you know what they are. It may not be the most pretty brand of basketball. It may not be the most exciting brand of basketball, but you know when you play Rutgers that you better bring some toughness and grit or you're not going to beat them. And I think that's the disconnect, is that Woodson has talked about these things. He's talked about wanting to, get the Final Fours and win national championships and schedule these tough games, but he hasn't won those games. And then he hasn't really delivered in terms of the on-court product of what he laid out. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are starting to question, because it's one thing to talk about things, but when you're now midway through year 3, you have to demonstrate them more consistently that he has.
And even more, the disconnect is, and I don't think when Mike Woodson was hired, people did not expect him to be Bob Knight, to be a carbon copy of him by any means. But I feel like there was an expectation, because he played for Bob Knight, to bring some of those redeeming characteristics to his teams at Indiana. So being, they were going to fight, they were going to be disciplined, they were going to, just be the tougher team. And maybe you could say through the first 2 seasons, there were flashes of that, but that's part of I think the major disconnect with this team is that there just seems like a lack of passion. Like there's times it just doesn't look right. And I think even more so to the Rutgers game, it was like you could basically predict what that game was going to be before it even happened. Like you just knew the narrative of that game. And that's I think that was the frustrating thing, is that you knew what was going to happen and it still didn't, like Indiana still couldn't change, how it happened. So, like I said, I don't think Mike Woodson was expected to be Bob Knight or anything like that, but I think there was a hope that because he played for him, you bring some of those characteristics and maybe kind of reinvigorate them into the program that they were lacking under Archie Miller. And that was another thing under Archie Miller, was like coming in out of Dayton, like his teams were supposed to be just hard-nosed, tough, and that seemed to be lacking under his teams at Indiana. For whatever reason, it didn't carry. Unfortunately, that's the way Indiana's team is kind of set up this season. And maybe that's because he mentioned the leadership. I mean, you're losing Miller Kopp, Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson. Even I think a guy like Tamar Bates was really good for the locker room. It's not all on the coaches; it's some on the players to be able to carry over that mindset and that kind of culture. So I think it's not, blame probably should be divvied out, not to one person.
Before we wrap up on this episode, as I mentioned early on, you watch a ton of Big Ten basketball. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the league in general right now, where we sit, I think, about a quarter of the way into the conference schedule. When you look at the games played, and most teams have played 4 or 5 games, so we have a pretty decent gauge on where things are heading. Purdue's already lost 2 conference games, which I don't think people expected. Wisconsin off to a really good start in terms of the league play. Shouldn't be particularly surprising given everything that they returned. The fact that they did a really, I think, smart thing by going out and getting AJ Storr out of the transfer portal. I think he's really kind of made their team more, I guess, adapted a little bit more to the modern style of basketball, getting an athletic wing that can go get you a bucket. And they don't make a lot of mistakes. They don't beat themselves. I mean, that's kind of the same thing going back to, you kind of look at these programs that are year in, year out competing atop the Big Ten, and you kind of can give an identity to them. And Wisconsin's another one of those teams that isn't going to beat themselves and play, take care of the ball and have solid fundamentals year in and year out. So just, I guess, kind of a 2-part question. I guess the consensus for most people that have watched it, the league seems quite a bit down this year based on where it was in previous year. Would you agree with that? And which teams do you kind of trust, at least at this point in the season, are going to be solid NCAA tournament teams?
I feel like maybe the top echelon of the conference right now, you look at Purdue, Wisconsin. I would put Illinois in there, but it's kind of the future is a little bit more uncertain because you don't know what the Terrence Shannon junior situation is going to look like. But I would put those three teams as probably, at the top of the league right now. And then I think Michigan State can maybe get there, but they've certainly underperformed to what was expected up to this point. The good thing is, or I don't know if a good thing, but what makes the league interesting this season is that there's a lot of parity, which has basically been how it's been, the last several seasons. It's tough to win on the road. There's going to be, you have Nebraska like blowing out Purdue, and I think Nebraska under Fred Hoiberg is taking just major steps forward, and that's been kind of impressive to see. The other side to it is that it's good games, but it's just terrible basketball. I mean, like the Rutgers Indiana game was just brutal to watch. It was close, but wasn't very good basketball. I think that's probably where the league is right now. There's going to be a lot of close games. It's not going to be the most well-played basketball. Like Maryland was another team I think you expected to be pretty good and just has been really flat. So ironically, this will probably be the season that a Big Ten team wins the national championship finally, because the league is not as good. And I agree with what you said. I feel like the quality is down. Maybe teams get better as the season goes on, but I think probably the only two teams I really trust right now are Wisconsin and Purdue. And I think Storr, that you mentioned, because I went to covered a game Iowa at Wisconsin. I think the thing you were circling around was that he just gives Wisconsin another dimension. They just haven't had that. They've been what they are, and this kind of widens the scope of what is possible for them. So, the league isn't bad basketball, but it's good games. I get close games. That's all.
How much more snow are you expecting out there in Iowa City? You got a big game right this weekend. Indiana, Iowa women.
Yeah, well, I guess two big games if you count. Nebraska comes here off the win against Purdue on Friday. Iowa, Nebraska men. Okay. Saturday, big one. Yeah, Saturday, big one. Indiana here at Iowa. So
how big is that game for the Iowa men?
It's decently big. It's not like vital, I don't think. But this would be one of like a legit shot to get a pretty good resume builder. The only real resume win they have right now is against Seton Hall, and that's only really because it's that one has aged well. It didn't look great at the moment, but it's not vital, but it's a good opportunity for Iowa to kind of continue to try to turn its season around.
How do the Indiana women match up coming into Iowa City? Obviously, Iowa's had some close games, right, this season to an extent. So they're the favorite to win the Big Ten, but I feel like it's for Indiana, not a game that anyone expects them to win, especially with how they played early in the season at Stanford, but an opportunity for them to kind of come in and maybe make a statement if they can play well.
The major key is it's going to be almost impossible to stop Caitlin Clark, but it's to make her inefficient. That's how Indiana beat them at Assembly last season, where they made her inefficient. They made her work for her points. That's the formula for Indiana to win again. And also, you just look at like the supporting cast around her. You probably have to hope for some bad games around Caitlin Clark. And on the flip side, Indiana needs major help outside of Mackenzie Holmes. Indiana's supporting cast, Chloe Moore McNeil, Sydney Parrish, Yarden Gerzone. They need to outperform Iowa's supporting cast and make up for what they might miss in not having someone like Caitlin Clark. Because Mackenzie Holmes is going to get hers, but she can't score at like the prolific rate that Caitlin.
Well, thanks as always, Tyler, for taking the time coming on the show. Always good to talk to you. Keep up the great work at the Des Moines Register. If you're not following Tyler, make sure you're doing so on social media. We're checking out his work in the Des Moines Register. As for Podcast on the Brink, thanks everybody as always for listening to this week's episode. We really appreciate it. We would also really appreciate it if you would go on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review or a rating. It really helps us continue to grow the show, helps us in the algorithm there. More people can find the show if we have more reviews and ratings. Same thing on Spotify. give us a 5-star rating over there as well. We appreciate the support, and it's a fun thing for us to do the podcast every week. Again, thanks, Tyler, for coming on, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.